Well, good evening. We'll go ahead and get started with producing wool for fiber enthusiasts. This will be a two-part webinar series. This will be the first night on the wool that's actually on the sheep. So no matter where you're at in the United States, this should help you in producing wool for fiber enthusiasts and specialty markets. Tomorrow night we'll be focusing on the wool off of the sheep. So more of the preparing the wool, processing it, and then what products to sell. And we will be taking questions, so please feel free to put those in the chat box. And we will look at those between each section, and then as well as any general ones at the end. So this program is brought to you by the American Sheep Industry Association. That's your national organization that represents the U.S. sheep producers. So just to become a part of that, it's easy. All you have to do is join your local state association, such as the California Wool Growers or the Maryland Sheep Breeders Association, your state local association. And that'll help you stay updated with weekly updates, monthly magazines, podcasts, webinars, and more. We also encourage you to join Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube and look up Sheep USA and Experience Wool. And also know that sheepusa.org is our website, and it has a lot of contacts for shearers and processors and such, as well as a lot of other resources. And this webinar is being recorded, so you can, if you miss some notes or anything like that, you can always go back to sheepusa.org and find that recording. And we're very happy to have Jeff Rupert on tonight. He is with Winborn Farm and raises Corriedales and Cormos. And they are some nice structurally looking sheep, and then some of the most amazing wool sheep that I have seen. So I know he won't brag about himself, but I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself more, Jeff.
Thanks, Heather. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. Thanks for having me. I'm not sure really in the end how much of an expert I am on hand spinning. Certainly not a hand spinner myself, but I've spent a lot of time around hand spinners and I think through osmosis, but I've spent a tremendous amount of time around wool and sheep, and that's the thing I love the most, is looking at wool, talking about wool, and raising it. I'm a 1991 graduate from Virginia Tech's vet school. I've been raising Corriedale sheep for 43 years. I added commercial fine wool sheep, a small commercial fine wool flock in 2005 based on the Downy Cormo bloodlines. I currently have 25 fine wool ewes and 60 Corriedale ewes approximately. I've been using Corriedale semen from Australia to improve the wool quality for the last 17 years. We haven't bought an American ram since 2000. I've judged wool at the Black Sheep Gathering, Keystone International Livestock Expo, and Lambtown in California. And I was really privileged to judge the Australian National Corriedale Junior Show twice in Bendigo, Australia. And that's it.
Yeah. That sounds great. So I am Heather Pierce, and I am the Wool Production and Specialty Markets Consultant for the American Sheep Industry Association. I grew up raising hand spinning sheep for many years, and I'm also still involved with many shows and fairs and festivals. And I'm also, in my spare time, a hand spinner and dabble in all of the various fiber arts. So I'm familiar with that and see both ends of the spectrum. I'd also like to recognize Krista Rochford tonight. She's on and will be helping with monitor questions tonight, and she's also with ASI. I'm going to start a poll now. So now that you know a little bit about us, we'd like to know just a little bit about you. So if you would like to go ahead and vote, that will help us just get to know you a little bit better. That looks like about everybody. So about half are from the Northeast, and then a little bit from different regions. And then it looks like a little over half are producers, and then some processors, some fiber enthusiasts, and some other. So thank you. So let's dive in and talk about why produce for fiber enthusiasts. So the main advantage is that you can sell your wool for upwards of 10 times the amount of a similar micron commercial fleece. So oftentimes we'll see a really nice hand spinning fleece go for $20 to $30 a pound. And so this can be really beneficial to those farm flocks where you need have fewer fleeces, fewer animals, but you can still make a good profit. But some things to consider that NISP markets are a limited number of buyers. So not everybody can be in that market. It takes a really nice high quality fleece. And so to get that high quality fleece, it'll take more time and then effort to raise those fleeces. So the easiest place to start, I think, is with your flock, looking at the basis of your flock and talking about breeds. So choose breeds that work well for your area. They won't, some breeds are harder to raise in some areas than others. For out in the West, where predators are an issue, you need something that can flock a little bit better. In the East, maybe the humidity and moisture can be a consideration. And so you kind of have a couple of different options. You can go for the purebred route and really keep that breed character, and work on breed preservation as well for some of them. Or you can go the crossbred route where you get really rapid changes and unique characteristics, but consistency through the fleece can be hard. So really look at what your goals are and what works for you in your area. It's a good place to start.
Right, and I think that the comment that I would make about the breeds that you choose is that if you're just having fun and having a small farm flock and playing with cross breeding sheep to get different fibers, that's great. It's a great idea, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if you're looking at getting into this as a venture where you're going to try and get a consistent product and, you know, kind of make a name for yourself for doing a certain kind of fiber, crossbreeding can probably be problematic because the wool that you get will be less predictable the more generations you go at a certain point. The first cross between, say, a fine wool and a long wool sheep will yield something really predictable in the medium wool range probably, but after that you can get wool that's all over the map, and it can be really difficult to get consistent wool. That's been my experience anyway with the commercial fine wool flock.
Thanks, Jeff. And now you can also, whether you're starting your flock or expanding it, look at color. And so white fleece dyes really well, and so your consumers might be looking for something like that. Or they might be looking for a colored fleece that you can leave either natural or dyed. But you do need to think about that you need an outlet for those colored skirtings. You might have a lot of those skirtings, and so you need a good outlet for those. And then also know that multicolored is okay for fiber enthusiasts. You can think about the Jacob sheep or some that are just naturally multicolored, and fiber enthusiasts tend to like those.
That's exactly right, Heather. And your comment about needing an outlet for the skirtings, if you're doing super high quality covered wool for hand spinners, that means the neck wool and anything that's not under the cover is potentially going to be skirtings. There's going to be some pretty high quality skirtings and high volume. So if you do natural colored sheep, there's nothing wrong with that, but the commercial outlet for that is going to be really not there as far as I know at this point, unless you can band together with a big group of natural colored breeders to further process the wool.
Looking at year-round production, now kind of moving into the next step. think it's really helpful to think about your end consumer, think like a fiber enthusiast, and understand what characteristics of the fleece are important to them and why. So that's going to help you, if you know those, what's important to them, that's going to help you evaluate your genetics and management, figure out how you can improve those. And then it's also going to help you work with them and understand them a little bit better. So you are on the same page about things and are speaking the same language.
And so probably the two biggest goals that you need to start thinking about would be that hand spinners want clean wool that has a relatively long staple. Those are probably the top two guidelines.
I absolutely agree. And so I think, just as Jeff said, one of the biggest things, first things that people think about for a specialty fleece is the contamination. And really, mostly what we're talking about is the vegetable matter, or VM. So it can be really difficult to remove. As you can see in the bottom picture, unless you're going to spend the time to pick out every single little piece of vegetable matter in that yarn, that is going to stay in the yarn. And you're going to end up with something really prickly. And that just doesn't really look very nice. And the biggest key, I think, is preventing that contamination early. So if you can just keep it from getting into the fleece in the first place, it makes it a ton easier down the road. If it is in the fleece, really make sure to skirt out those heavily VM areas, or you can consider processing it in a mill or in a commercial market. They can handle it a little bit better than a hand spinner might be able to. And then you can also have contamination like manure and twine, and you can easily remove those during skirting.
So, go ahead.
So yeah, so preventing contamination for the get-go is really the key. So blanketing, and we're going to talk about that more in just a minute. I'll let Jeff talk about that. And then also think about feeding. If you can have them on pasture, sometimes you won't get as much chaff and hay in as you would in a confined area. And you can also think about feeding closer to the ground. If feed and hay is up on top of them, right above their head, all of that is going to fall down into the fleece, right into their neck area. So if you can keep the feed closer to the ground, that'll help. And also, sheep have a tendency to grab a mouthful of hay and then eat over each other's backs, again, getting all of that hay into their fleece. So if you can prevent that in some way, have a system, feeder that prevents that, that's helpful. And also think about adding a shelter or windbreak to keep the wind from kicking up that dirt and hay and throwing that into the fleece. And then make sure to clean your pens regularly. And know that there are lots and lots of options. Be creative in ways to prevent hay from getting in the first place.
Righto. So what we do is in our operation is that we try to get the lamb shorn right after they're weaned, around 60 days, anytime after 60 days old, and the coats go on, just like you see in this picture here. And they stay on the good wool sheep. You know, any sheep with real keeper wool is going to be coated and stay coated all year long, and have the coats changed periodically up to about probably 6 times through the year as they grow. You can see in this picture how there's a lot of different colored blankets in there, and this is a picture of my sheep, and so that just is a good way for me to point out that I've used probably all the different kinds of sheep coats there are, and there's several good ones out there. I don't think there's any that are perfect or have a particular advantage. Some people like the Rocky Mountain sheep coats, and I've used them. And currently, what I can get in my area are the ones called fine row ones. But whatever ones you get, it's good to have elastic gathers in the back and around the sides, and not to have like pull strings and stuff to gather up the blanket in the back, because other sheep will chew on them and pull them to pieces. So, and all the coats that I've used from any maker, they eventually rip and need to be repaired. So they'll do a lot of stitching. Yeah, okay. The one thing I wanted also mention about, especially for the New England people that are on tonight, is you may have already noticed that if you do a coat change on the sheep and and the next day it rains, or the next night it rains, a lot of times if the coat doesn't fit perfectly, it'll slip sideways, and you'll come out and find several coats are off the sheep. They're dragging them around. You have to remove them. It's quite a pain, but that's why we charge a lot for the wool that we produce.
I think that last one is that coats might not work for all areas. Like if they're out by themselves, a lot of times it's hard to keep coats on them. And then I think in some more humid, wet areas, it can be challenging.
That's true. And the other thing, before I forget to mention it, is not all sheep are appropriate for covers. My understanding is that the long wool sheep don't do well because of matting and such. But I also wanted to tell people that in my own flock, the ewes will age out, of their wool quality will age out. So, as the sheep ages, at a certain point, since wool's made of protein, that wool quality they'll stop growing the staple length, and they'll stop growing the crimp and character of wool that hand spinners really are after. And at that point, there's no point in wasting a coat on them. It's not productive.
The second thing that Jeff mentioned as being probably the most important is the staple length. And so really, we're looking at 3 to 6 inches. So fine sheep, maybe 3 to 4.5 inches is ideal. Medium sheep can be a little bit coarser at 3.5 to 5 inches. And then coarse sheep, you're typically going to comb that wool, and so you can go 4 to 6 inches. Fiber enthusiasts are really handy and can work with things outside of those ranges, but it really limits your pool and who might be interested in it if it is outside of those. So if you can stick within those ranges, it's going to help or work for more fiber enthusiasts and be easier for processors as well. And so to get that, just make sure that you shear at the appropriate time. Always shearing about once a year, or if it's a long wool, twice a year. And then also breed for good lengths. And then as part of staple length, as you're shearing, if you go over an area and then go over it again, you're going to get these little second cuts like you see in the bottom picture. And that's going to make a noil or a lump in the yarn as the hand spinner is working with it. So make sure to get those out of there. Ask your shearer to take their time to try to stop them from being in there in the first place. And then if they are in there, then shake out the fleece or pulling it out during skirting. And then soundness. You can have a tip break, a full break, such as the one in the picture, or something that's tender. But either way, this is going to create problems for carding and combing, whether it's the hand spinner or a processor. And it can make noils, little tiny balls in the yarn. And so you're not going to get a smooth, consistent yarn. So if you do have an issue with this, make sure if it's already in the fleece to sell to an experienced hand spinner or a felter, especially felters. That is often fine for them, or someone that's experienced and really likes that fleece might still be interested. And then to prevent that in the future, consider your management practices. So your timing of shearing, making sure that it's with lambing often or stressful times. And then watching nutritional changes. So anything that's going to be make a big nutritional change or stressful, try to time it with that, so that way you're shearing and might get a break in the same place.
Yeah, there's all kinds of, I think, in our area at least, there's all kinds of benefits to shearing a month before lambing, because that lambing is, for the stress of lambing on the ewe is a really very critical time when you can develop a break in the fleece. And then if you do shear a month before lambing, be sure that the coat fits the ewe really well when you put the coat back on after shearing. It's very rare in my flock, but if the coats are loose fitting around the legs, you can have a lamb get its head stuck in the leg hole. and that's pretty much a disaster. So that's something to avoid. But I'd say timing of shearing for medium wool and fine wool flocks, right a month before they lamb, is the best.
It's a really good tip. And then color. So white fleeces should be really nice, bright white, and then color should be something attractive. So you breed for that good color. And I know Jeff has a lot of experience with this.
Yeah, well, I mean, we developed an understanding since we started to do the importing semen from Australia that that color, that white color and luster is highly heritable as far as I can tell. And so even if you are in a high humidity area, you can grow wool like this. This is a fleece off of one of my fine wool ewes, and that wool's not particularly fine, but you know, it's fine enough. I think it's probably ideal for hand spinning, but that's just a result of genetics. You've got to select white wool rams, and you'll get there with it. Yeah. Otherwise, the other side of that issue is you'll see a lot of show sheep that have real yellow gummy fleeces if they get more than 2 inches long, and it's just because you haven't selected for white wool.
So that's a natural color. And then we should also talk about unscourable color, and that's generally from management. So you can have something such as pen stain, manure that gets stuck on the fleece. And so to prevent that, make sure to keep your areas clean and dry. And you can also have a canary stain or fleece rot, and that's from high humid and wet. They're so hot and humid to make those for a long enough periods of time. And so to help prevent that, if it is an issue for you, breed for better lock structure. So the lockier fleeces, it will let air flow through them. And then also think about the age of the fleece. So in the picture, these are 2 fleeces from the same producer, and they're just a year apart. For this producer, that was what 1 year did into the color of it. So process in a timely manner or sell it in a timely manner. And then fiber diameter. Know that finer is usually softer and better for close to skin garments, and coarse is better for more durable items. And whatever you choose, pick something that your buyers might want, and then breed for that. If most of your buyers are interested in something coarse, then you can think about that, or maybe you want to fine it up. And also breed for more uniform fiber diameter. So this can be fiber between, we often think of it as across the fleece, so we'd like a more uniform across the fleece, and then also between fibers next to each other. So the more consistency you have throughout the fibers, the softer it's going to be.
Yeah, if you have access to micron testing, if you're able to select rams that are micron tested, you know, unless you're in the long wool business, I would recommend paying a lot of attention to comfort factor, which is the percentage of fibers under 30 microns, because those anything 30 microns or above are going to be prickly against the skin. And one, you know, as Heather said, wanting a uniform fiber diameter, I think, you know, you really want to pay attention to the breech wool, to not have coarse wool on the breech of the animal, but you also want to see crimp that's even from butt to tip, so that it's the same even crimp lines all the way out to the end of the fiber. And I think that's a really good way to judge if you've got uniform fiber diameter as well.
Yeah, if you think about it from a fiber artist perspective, they are often not going to be able to process all of that wool and blend it together. So they're going to be doing small areas at a time. And so if they are very different in diameter or length or anything like that, then it's going to be really challenging as they make that yarn. It's going to be very inconsistent. And then again, that lock structure. Some areas this is probably better for than others. Some fiber artists prefer a lockier fleece. You hear that quite often. And then it can, again, help in more humid, wet areas to make more airflow through the fleece. And so you can breed for a better lock structure. And then also with locks, you can have a cotted or partially felted fleece, which makes it really hard to comb and card that fleece, and then creates more waste during processing. And it can also be, fiber artists will often, or sometimes, spin from the lock. So they take a raw piece of wool and pull out that lock, and then are going to spin directly from that lock. And so if it's all cotted together, it's hard. It just limits it so that you really can't use it if you want to spin from the lock. So think about your management. Your blanket might be too tight and rubbing, making those fibers stick together and caught. And so also breed against sheep that tend to have cotted fleeces.
Right. The fine wool sheep are particularly, seems like, susceptible to felting on the tips when you don't change the coats often enough. And those nice big locks that Heather's talking about, the Australians call that a blocky tip. And you can actually see from the side of the show ring, you can see those sheep that have the blocky tip where the wool just breaks into locks as they move. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I think it's just attractive.
Mm-hmm.
And also crimp. It's really important because it gives the product elasticity and memory. So rather than something that just falls, it helps things bounce back into place and gives it some life. So to get more crimp, breed for it, and breed what is ideal for your breed. Some, such as a coarse wool, have a more wavy crimp than a fine wool, which have a more distinct crimp. And then also breed for more uniform crimp. So you can see in the picture below, that's all from the same fleece, but they vary quite a bit in that crimp. And again, a fiber enthusiast or artist will often be working with small sections at a time. So the more uniform you can make it, the better.
Right, and as I said, even for the strong wool sheep like Brahmins, the crimp evenness should extend from the base of the fiber at the skin to the tip. And these samples that you see here, it looks like the crimp runs out as you go to the tip, and ideally you really want to see that crimp holding out exactly the same at the tip as it is near the skin.
And then handle, so that's how soft the fleece is. So usually a finer fleece will be a little bit softer and better handling than a coarse fleece. But even if you have two, say, fine fleeces together, one of them, and they're the same micron, one of them can be a lot better handling than the other. It's just softer feeling. And that's usually due to either weather damage or uniformity of fiber, or the fiber diameter. So if there's weather damage on it, that's going to feel a little bit harsher. And then also if you have some fine fibers right next to really coarse fibers, that's going to feel a bit harsher.
Yep.
And then luster, that's the shine of the fleece. And it is important because those first impressions make a big difference to fiber enthusiasts. They're paying a lot of money for that fleece. So they want something that looks really nice. So generally breed for more luster and more attractive fleece. And then we should talk about other fibers. So things like Crimp and hair and medullated fibers. They're different in that true wool fiber has a solid core. And those Crimp and hair and medullated fibers have all or portions of the fiber that are hollow inside. And so that shows the dye differently. The way the light refracts is going to show differently when you dye them. So a black in a wool fiber versus a black in a hair fiber are going to be a different color black. And then they're also going to protrude from the yarn and be harsh and itchy in that end product. And they tend to be different lengths, so they make an uneven yarn as a hand spinner. So really breed against these fibers if it should be a regular true wool fleece. Good rule of thumb generally is that don't mix wool fibers with hair fibers, whether that's on the skirting table or out in your flock. And double coated breeds and heritage breeds would be the exception. That is perfectly fine for them to have hair in theirs, and it's oftentimes fun to, as a fiber artist, to be able to play and make different things, either keeping those two coats together or separating them. And then also colored fibers. So if you have a nice white fleece, you don't want any black fibers running through that, because it can be seen in the end product, and then you're going to have to pick those out by hand if you don't want them in there. So yeah, if it's a white fleece, you should breed out that color. It should not be in there. And then separate white and colored fleeces on the shearing table or anywhere. Make sure those white really stay separate from those colored fleeces. And then weight is important. We often think of weight as more for commercial type fleeces, but it is important in hand spinning fleeces. The more one sheep can produce, the better off it is for the producer, since they're selling things either by the pound or, if it's a product, by the ounce. And then also, from a fiber artist perspective, some things like a giant rug or an Afghan is going to take a good amount of wool. So they need a decent amount, a good volume, to be able to produce that. So generally breed for heavier fleeces.
Yeah, one way that you can judge that if you're out selecting breeding stock, the Australians like to talk about the amount of wool between the poles, which is like between the ears. When you see a ram that's really woolly across the on his head from between the ears, that's really a good indicator that you'll have a heavy shearing fleece. Plus, if it's breed appropriate, having wool that's down the legs is a good idea, and encouraging your wool on your belly to be actual wool and not belly wool that doesn't grow any staple length also helps, because you get higher quality wool lower down on the body that's hand spinnable and marketable.
And also pay attention to yield. As a grower, if you're going to be processing that wool, a higher yield is going to make more product for you and more profit. So the yield is, if you take the raw weight of the fleece and account for the grease and the vegetable matter and processing waste that'll be taken out of it, what is left. So that clean fleece. And then for buyers that are going to be processing the wool themselves, as somebody who's going to be buying your fleece, they know that the higher yielding it is, the more product they might get, and they might be willing to pay more for that. So breed for less grease and manage for less contaminants, vegetable matter, and dirt.
That's true, to a point anyway. You need some grease in the wool, or otherwise you get, I think, a really sort of fly away kind of less dense fleece. But too much grease, particularly in the fine wool sheep, and you can get a gummy fleece that hand spinners really won't like.
Thank you, Jeff. That's a good point. And then would you like to explain this one, Jeff?
This is just a picture. It's sort of sideways, but it's a picture of one of my Corriedale ewes with the coat off, ready to be shorn. This might be a good time to mention about, so you can see that if you keep them covered, how clean the wool is all the way out to the tip. And one thing that I wanted to be sure to mention when you're shearing is it's so important to try to keep the wool out of that crease on the neck. Try to keep the vegetable matter out of that crease, because when you take the coat off and the shearer tips the sheep up to shear, then all the chaff and alfalfa pieces and bits are going to fall right onto the shearing surface, and that's going to get all in the fleece. So if you're just starting out, when I first started out coating the sheep, or if you have just a bad year where you've got some hay that gets really a lot of it in the neck, it's pretty unconventional. But if you do your own shearing, you can take the sheep to the side, shear the head and neck, and discard that, and then shear them traditionally after that. And that's a good way to keep that stuff out, because that's a major way to get contamination. Once you tip them up and start shearing, the stuff falls back. And then when the fleece falls to the shearing mat, it's going to get all contaminated.
Thanks, Josh. And I think this is kind of the end of this section. Krista, do we have any questions that would be good now?
Yeah, there's a couple questions. So one is referring to the timeline of selling the fleece. There was the photo of the two fleeces, different colors. Is there a guide for what is considered a timely manner to sell those fleeces?
I often, for myself, and others might consider it as well, if I can't sell that fleece as a raw fleece within a year, then I'll probably go ahead and process it. It's really up to you and how long. Some fleeces will hold their color better than others. So it's really up to you. But if you see a big difference in the color over about a year or 2 years, then consider processing then.
I totally agree. Plus, if you're a producer, your product's going to be mounting up if you haven't sold it within a year.
And then I'll read out another question here. It says, is there something that can be done when feeding large round bales to minimize the hay getting in the fleece? The round bales are cheaper per pound, but that does not mean they tend to have hay falling down on them. I have long wool sheep, so I do not believe the coats would work.
I think one of the most helpful things that I have seen is having the feeder systems where you could put, I haven't actually tried a large round, but a big bale in the middle, and then it slowly collapses in on itself. The sheep push it in as they eat, and so it collapses in. And those tend to, I think, not get quite so much hay on them, especially as opposed to just putting it out in the corral or the pasture. So I like those ones that they collapse in as the sheep feed. Do you have any more experience with that, Jeff?
That sounds like a good answer to me, because my answer there is I've never used round bales exactly for that reason. I just don't know how I could keep my wool quite as clean with round bales. I might be forced to try, because it is getting difficult to find small square bales now. Even in our area out east, a lot of people just don't have the labor force to help put up square bales. So far we're able to do it, but I'm sorry, I don't have any special knowledge there.
I think maybe something that is helpful too that Jeff mentioned is that it said that if you're shearing the wool yourself, you can clean up some of that vegetable matter in that neck area ahead of time or while you're doing it. And so work with your shearer, see if they'll be willing to take the time or maybe let you do that ahead of time.
There's a couple more questions coming in. Do you find that straw is better bedding than wood shaving?
I haven't tried wood shavings, but I would think so. I would think straw, nice quality wheat straw would be preferable to shavings. I think shavings are going to have a way of working into the fleece. Even coated sheep, probably the belly and on up the side of the sheep is going to be a problem if you're using shavings.
I agree. As a fiber and artist working with wool, a lot of times the hay or straw especially the straw, is easier to get out of the fleece. It's a big piece that sticks out, and so it's easy to pull out. Sometimes the wood shavings are smaller, they break up, and they really work their way in, which makes it harder.
A couple more here. Would you give some suggestions for outlets for skirtings?
That's a really good question. Do you want me to talk?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff. Yep.
I mean, that's the most timely question we have right now, right? Because this has been the first year where we haven't really been able to just sort of dump our commercial wool into the commercial wool pool. They're going away. So probably for a lot of people, the answer to that is going to be further processing. A lot of times with our neck wool and the leg wool, we can have that processed into roving pretty effectively through different, small operations. We've been pretty lucky the last few years to be able to sell our clean wool that is uncovered to processors or I guess folks making products like Swan Island Blanket Company and similar folks like that are taking our wool that's uncovered and using it. But that's huge, and that's why I mentioned about the natural colored wool, that times can be very tough unless you're willing to further process it, your uncovered wool into roving or even into yarn. I think probably roving is preferred though, because with yarn, then you get into having odd lots left over, and it can be really difficult to sell. There's one other thing I was going to say about that. Well, at any rate, yeah, I think that further processing is probably into roving is one of the better ways to do it. Oh, I know what I was going to say, and keep in mind too that we have, although we're lucky to have some fleeces that look like the one you see here on the screen, we have a lot of older ewes that are uncovered. So we deal with that in a very real way. We have hundreds of pounds of wool that we need this year to find a home for.
There's another one here. There's a participant that lives in a very humid area and has pulled dorsets. What is the best way to keep a fleece clean? Because blankets sound like they won't work very well.
Man. That's a matter of genetics. I just have to say, because covering is your only option unless you're going to put them on like they do in Australia in their stud sheds and put them on grates and no bedding. But it's especially with modern pulled dorsets, it's going to be awfully hard to find coverable quality wool, unfortunately, right now. But you just have to breed for it. You have to select white wooled rams with character and luster.
I think maybe thinking about some of those, how you're feeding, how much wind there is, how clean are you keeping your areas. The cleaner you can keep the area, the better off you'll be. Yeah,
if you can put them on raised floors, that could definitely work. But I will say, people talk a lot of times about feeding and different aspects of feeding, but we feed a lot of corn to our sheep, and I don't find that it has the kind of impact. People say, oh, if you feed too much corn, you get yellow fleeces, and I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't see that.
I think that about covers what was for this section. We can do another Q&A at the end.
Sounds good.
Cool.
So next we'll go ahead and talk about shearing. It's a really important time. It only happens once or twice a year, but it's so important to how that fleece, the quality that it will be. So preparing for shearing. Again, like we mentioned earlier, try to time that with stressful situations like lambing, right ahead of lambing. And then make sure that it's the same time every year. That will help you keep a consistent staple length for it. And then preparing for shearing. Your pens should be clean and dust and mud free area. And you want to withhold them from feed and water in that pen for at least 4 to 12 hours. And that's going to help the shearer position the sheep, as well as have less feces and urine on the shearing floor as they're shearing that sheep. So really a covered pen is ideal, and to make sure that you do pen them ahead of time. And then as you're preparing that shearing floor, make sure that there's electricity nearby, that it's a strong, big enough shearing floor that's going to be easy to clean. And to be able to clean that, you'll need a broom, and then having a skirting table and bags to put the fleeces in nearby is really handy.
I was, when people bring this part up, I always like to tell people how you don't have, this stuff doesn't have to be fancy. You know, you see pictures of the big shearing sheds and a big skirting table and all. Skirting tables are great and everyone should have one for sure. But the key is really super clean. Like the broom is my best friend and in the shearing area. But I just use these 4x12 sheets of plywood and put 2 or 3 of those together and move them around my farm to where the different pens where I need to do my shearing. Everything is mobile and portable and simple. You just have to keep the area clean where you shear, and then you have to move the fleece immediately to a clean area to skirt. That's all there's to it.
I agree. And like with the plywood, we have a nice skirting table, and then we also have one that's homemade. And the only thing I would caution you with about a homemade skirting table is don't make one out of chicken wire, because that chicken wire tends to catch the fleeces. Fleeces get caught on them. And so we used some fencing, the plastic fencing, that's worked really well. So it doesn't have to be fancy or expensive, but make sure that the fleece isn't going to get caught on it. And then shearing. For all the sheep, which wool should never be shorn. And then always shear sheep, like it from white wool, and then do colored wool next. And then finally, if you have haired sheep around, do those last, because you don't want those things contaminating the others. You don't want a black fiber contaminating that nice white wool. And you don't want hair, certainly, to be contaminating any of your wool.
Yep.
And then skirting. Oftentimes you'll do 2 skirtings, and the first one will be right after you shear, and that's going to be to remove the twine and tags and other contaminants. And if your shearer hasn't already taken out the belly and leg areas, make sure to take out that belly and the hair ahead of time so that it doesn't get wrapped in with the fleece. And then shake out any second cuts. So oftentimes to keep up with the shear, it has to be fairly quick, but you can get a lot of the stuff that you really don't want in there out. And then once you're done, roll it up so that usually do 1/3 and then 1/3 of the fleece, and then roll it down the length. And then put it in a bag and keep that bag open and in a cool area out of the sun. The fleece will sweat and condensate, and so keep it out of the sun at least. And usually a 40-gallon clear trash bag works well. They're cheap, but that size works well. And then usually, go ahead, Jeff.
Good to have a really big bag, much bigger than you think that you need. And the clear ones are nice because if you end up showing a fleece, you have to have a clear bag, and you can get them on Amazon.
I like it for when you show. And then is it, if you have 20 fleeces sitting out there, it's helpful. A lot of times you can see well enough through the bag that you don't have to open it up again, which is handy. And then usually it's hard to do a second skirting, a really thorough skirting during shearing, because you're having to move along fast enough. So oftentimes you'll do it later. If you can do it one at a time while you're shearing, even better, because you're not allowing any of that vegetable matter to work its way farther into the fleece. But usually it's done later. And then I will say to join us for the second part tomorrow night for the rest on second skirting. And we also talk about what it looks like, how well you need to skirt for a hand spinner, and then how well you need to skirt for a mill, that sort of thing. So tomorrow night we'll cover that skirting, and then skirting for a mill, skirting for fiber artists. And then we'll actually take a quick tour of a mill and processing, and then have some top tips on finding a mill and then working well with them, finding what works for you. And then look at different products to sell, whether that's the raw wool or processed wool or actual items that you might sell. And then where to sell. You could do it at your farm, online, fairs and festivals, farmers markets. So we'll discuss all of that tomorrow night. Any final questions?
Yep, we have a few here. Do you have any recommendations for getting rid of chewing lice on super fine, super dense sheep?
Well, lice are generally really easy to kill. I mean, they're the easiest because I mean they're super susceptible to any kind of pyrethrin pour on. So you know if you shear them, pour on uh, 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 pyrethrin based insecticide, uh, generally from any farm supply store, and then repeat that 2 weeks later, move them to a clean shed, you're done.
Where do you typically store your fleeces?
We store our fleeces in the house with the bags open in a cool, dark area. Yeah, not in the hot, humid attic or in a basement that's damp. What Heather mentioned about if you get them right in front of a window and it's clear plastic bags, they'll sweat and it'll mess it up. So keep them away from windows.
I'd add to that, and I've seen a couple of fleeces that have to be stored by the fireplace, and it gave them a really harsh handle. So I think again, it almost acted like it was weathered. So again, watching where you put it, and then also think about moths. Really don't want moths to get in and then ruin your entire clip. And then mice sometimes try to build nests in them. Not often, but sometimes. So just different things to think about.
What resources do you recommend for someone new to breeding for fleece quality?
Yeah, I would just say try and get a mentor that lives somewhere near you to consult with. Would be my advice. I'm not too well versed with texts. Heather?
I think maybe there are some texts and resources. Really, I would recommend having a mentor by you, because especially being in the same area, they're going to understand the same challenges that you might face. So that's really important. And then also going to local shows and festivals can be really helpful. Whether it's a live animal show or a wool show, you can learn a lot from them, and the judges will often talk to you about it. So you can learn a lot from those places.
Yeah, the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival and the Black Sheep Gathering are two that I know about that are really excellent resources if you're trying to decide if you want to get into it and what breed you want, because they'll typically have a ton of breeds, some very rare breeds, and also the ones that are more common, and you can really get a full spectrum of wool types and decide, you know, what you want to do at one of those two venues. I'm sure I think there are more like that. Isn't there one in Michigan probably? And you know, but that's a great idea.
There's another person that raises in high heat and humidity and deals with yellow tips. Can you talk more about increasing airflow through the fleece?
You know, we're thinking about adding some serious fans to our barn and actually rebuilding the barn, and so that's what I'm going to do to try to combat that problem. But there is no way around the fact that there's going to be a certain amount of color in the wool that's scourable. Heather mentioned that some, like urine staining and things like that, are unscourable, but a lot of our Corriedale U fleeces end up what I call a cream color, but you put them under the kitchen sink with a little dishwashing liquid and they come out completely white. So I wouldn't, to a certain extent, you can't be too obsessive about it, but I think that changing the coats, using the lightest weight coat that you can have, and having some air circulating with fans. But my friends in Australia that have exceptionally fine or exceptionally soft Corriedale wool, their ewes also are cream colored a lot of times. The majority of the wool clip. It doesn't look quite as fancy as some of the wool you saw here tonight, but once it's scoured, it does.
There's some questions about wool types that are considered very coarse. For example, is an Icelandic type wool with 2 lengths considered very coarse wool?
Yeah, I think those are really neat heritage breeds, and I mean, my sense of it is that there are hand spinners out there that really like to work with heritage breeds and get jazzed about it. But I would suggest that if you're laser beam focused on trying to cultivate a market for yourself, that you may not want to have say Corriedales and Icelandics together in the same flock. You probably want to pick 1 or 2 areas and go for them. I think that when you get coarse fibers, double coated breeds, and you start running them with more traditional medium or fine wool sheep, then you're going to have trouble keeping those fibers out of the wool clip, and it's going to make it less desirable.
I think usually when I think of Icelandic, I think of a heritage breed, not necessarily a coarse breed, because the undercoat is decently fine. So I don't think of it necessarily a coarse breed, but just the heritage dual coated breed.
And the last question here, what is the cause of, forgive me, I don't know what this is, scurf?
Trying to think what they mean there. Do you know what that's referring to, Heather?
I think sometimes I know I've heard you use scurf in a few different ways. I think a lot of times we talk about the dander that'll sometimes show up in wool, and we don't tend to run into that around here, so I can't really speak to it, except for that I have seen them in fleeces from other areas, and it is very hard to work with as a hand spinner because you really just can't get all of that out of the fleece, and so whatever it takes to get rid of that, do that, because it's going to be really undesirable for a hand spinner if it's in there.
I've seen that only in my older sheep. And those, as I mentioned, are the ones that age out, and that becomes commercial wool.
And that's all the questions we have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Jeff, for being on tonight. I think you got a lot of good practical advice. So we really appreciate your time and joining us. And make sure to pop back on tomorrow night for part 2, where we'll go over all of the second part where the wool is off of the sheep. So look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks. It was fun. Thanks, Heather.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff.
All right, take care.